The autumn wind cut through the Colorado Territory like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Charlotte Whitmore pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the abandoned mining shack. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk imported from San Francisco, now torn and stained with mud. From her desperate flight through the mountains, 3 days since she'd fled from her father's ranch, from the gilded cage he'd built around her life, from the marriage contract he'd signed with Silas Blackwood without so much as asking her consent. The memory of that final confrontation still burned in her chest like swallowed fire. "You'll marry him, Charlotte, and that's final," her father had declared, his weathered face set in stone. "Blackwood's got more cattle than any man in 3 counties, and his offer will save this ranch from ruin. I won't be sold like livestock, Papa." She'd shot back, her green eyes blazing with defiance. "I don't love him. I don't even respect him." "Love," Theodore Whitmore had laughed bitterly. "Love won't pay the debts, girl. Won't keep the bank from taking everything your grandfather built. Blackwood's willing to overlook your spirited nature in exchange for legitimacy. His money's good as gold, even if it came from questionable dealings." That was the moment Charlotte knew her father had already made his choice. She was nothing more than currency to him now, a transaction to be completed. The wedding was set for the following Sunday, whether she agreed or not. But Charlotte Whitmore had never been one to accept defeat quietly. She'd spent that night carefully planning her escape, gathering what little money she'd hidden away from her dress allowance, selecting sturdy clothes that could withstand hard travel. When dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, she was already miles away, riding her mare Duchess through pine-scented trails that led away from everything she'd ever known. Now, as she huddled in the decrepit shack, listening to the wind howl through gaps in the rotting timber, Charlotte wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Her food was nearly gone, her water running low, and winter was coming fast to these high-country peaks. Worse still, she'd spotted dust clouds on the horizon that morning, riders, probably Blackwood's men, still hunting for their boss's runaway ride. The sound of approaching hoof beats made her blood turn to ice. Charlotte pressed herself against the far wall of the shack, barely daring to breathe as the riders drew closer. Through a crack in the weathered boards, she could see 3 men on horseback, their faces hard and determined beneath the brims of their hats. "Trail goes cold here," one of them called out, his voice carrying an ugly edge. "But she can't have gotten far on foot. Blackwood wants her found before the first snow," another replied. "Dead or alive, he says, long as there's enough left to prove she can't embarrass him no more." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. Dead or alive. So much for Silas Blackwood's supposed affection for his intended bride. She'd known the man was ruthless in business, had heard whispers about mysterious accidents that befell anyone who crossed him, but she'd never imagined he'd be willing to kill her simply for refusing to submit. The riders moved on after what felt like hours, their voices fading into the distance. Charlotte remained frozen against the wall until full darkness fell, then finally allowed herself to breathe normally. She needed to keep moving. But in which direction? The trails she knew led back toward her father's ranch, toward certain capture. The unknown paths stretching deeper into the wilderness offered freedom, but also the very real possibility of death from exposure or wild animals. As she wrestled with her impossible choice, a new sound reached her ears, the gentle lowing of cattle carried on the night wind. Where there were cattle, there were people, maybe not friendly people, but at this point, Charlotte was desperate enough to take that chance. She gathered her few belongings and slipped out into the starlit darkness, following the sound across a series of rolling meadows until she crested a low hill and saw the warm yellow glow of windows in the distance. A ranch house, modest but well-maintained, with several outbuildings and a corral filled with horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and possibly food. Charlotte hesitated at the edge of the yard, sudden doubts flooding her mind. What if these people knew her father? What if they'd already heard about the reward Blackwood was surely offering for her return? What if they simply turned her away to face the wilderness alone? Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the front door of the house opened, spilling golden light across the porch. A man stepped out, tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the lamplight. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. But there was something careful in the way he scanned the darkness, as if he'd sensed her presence. "I know you're out there," he called softly, his voice carrying a surprising gentleness. "Been watching my cattle get spooked for the last 10 minutes. If you're looking for trouble, you should know I'm armed. If you're looking for help," he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Well, everyone deserves a chance to state their case." Charlotte stepped forward into the circle of light. Her chin raised despite her fear. She cut a striking figure even in her bedraggled state tall. For a woman, with auburn hair that caught fire in the lamplight and eyes the color of spring grass, the torn wedding dress told its own story, one that made the rancher's expression shift from wariness to something approaching understanding. "Name's Thomas Brennan," he said after a long moment, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "This is the Double B Ranch, and you look like someone who's had a hell of a time getting here." "Charlotte," she replied, her voice hoarse from days of fear and little water. "Charlotte Whitmore." And yes, you could say that. Recognition flickered in Thomas's dark eyes, but not the kind Charlotte had feared. There was no calculating gleam, no thoughts of reward money. Instead, she saw something that had been absent from her life for far too long: simple human compassion. "The Whitmore spreads a fair piece from here," Thomas observed. "Long way to travel in a wedding dress, even a torn one, especially with winter coming on." Charlotte's composure finally cracked. The weight of the last 3 days, the terror and exhaustion and desperate uncertainty, all came crashing down at once. "I couldn't," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "I couldn't marry him, not even to save Papa's ranch, not even if it meant losing everything." Thomas studied her for a long moment, taking in the genuine distress, the bone-deep exhaustion, the way she held herself like someone who'd been pushed past all reasonable limits. When he spoke again, his voice was firm with decision. "Well then," he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward his front door, "I reckon you'd better come inside, get warm, get fed, and then we can figure out what comes next." As Charlotte stepped across the threshold into the warmth and safety of the Double B Ranch, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if Thomas Brennan's kindness would extend beyond a single night's shelter. But for the first time since her flight began, she wasn't facing the darkness alone. Behind her, the wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the promise of winter and the distant threat of pursuing riders. But inside the ranch house, a fire crackled in the hearth, and Charlotte Whitmore began to believe that perhaps she might survive her rebellion after all. The lonely rancher had taken her side when no one else would. Now the question remained, would it be enough to keep her free? The interior of Thomas Brennan's ranch house was a study in comfortable simplicity. Hand-hewn furniture built to last generations, colorful Navajo rugs covering pine floors, and shelves lined with well-worn books that spoke of a man who valued knowledge as much as hard work. Charlotte found herself in a world away from the ornate excess of her father's mansion, where every piece of furniture had been chosen to impress rather than comfort. "Sit," Thomas commanded gently, guiding her to a chair near the stone fireplace. "I'll get some coffee going and see what I can rustle up for supper." Charlotte sank into the chair with a grateful sigh, feeling the warmth from the fire begin to penetrate the bone-deep chill that had settled into her. During 3 days of mountain exposure, she watched Thomas move efficiently round his kitchen, noting the practiced way he worked. This was a man who'd grown accustomed to taking care of himself, someone who didn't rely on others to manage the basic necessities of life. "You live here alone?" she asked, accepting the tin cup of hot coffee he offered with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. "Just me and my foreman, Miguel," Thomas replied, settling into the chair across from her. "He's got a little place down by the creek with his wife Rosa. They help me run the cattle operation. Been with me since I started this place 5 years ago." Charlotte nodded, wrapping her fingers around the warm metal of the cup. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate China tea she was accustomed to, but it tasted like salvation. "You built all this in 5 years, bought the land from a prospector who struck out." Thomas explained, stirring beans and salt pork in a cast-iron pot. Previous owner left in a hurry, so I got it cheap. Spent the first 2 years just making the buildings livable and clearing fields for hay. The cattle came after. There was pride in his voice, but also a weariness that Charlotte recognized. She'd seen the same expression on her father's face during the difficult years, before he'd started entertaining Silas Blackwood's offers. Building something from nothing in this harsh country took everything a person had to give. "What made you choose ranching?" she asked, genuinely curious. "It's not an easy life." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, focused on his cooking. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Lost my family back in Kansas. Cholera took my wife and daughter during the epidemic of '72. After that," he shrugged, a gesture that said more than words could. "Didn't seem much point in staying where everything reminded me of what I'd lost." Charlotte felt her heart clench with sympathy. She'd been so focused on her own troubles that she hadn't considered what sorrows might have driven Thomas to this isolated life. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been unbearable." It was, Thomas admitted, ladling the simple stew into 2 bowls. "But that's the thing about grief, you either let it bury you, or you use it to build something new. I chose to build." He handed her a bowl and a spoon, then settled back into his chair with his own meal. Charlotte took a tentative bite and found herself surprised by how good the simple food tasted. After 3 days of nothing but the few hardtack biscuits she'd managed to pack, even beans and salt pork seemed like a feast. "Now then," Thomas said after they'd eaten in comfortable silence, "for a few minutes, suppose you tell me what's got you running through the mountains in a wedding dress." Charlotte set down her spoon, suddenly feeling the weight of her situation pressing down on her again. Where to begin? How to explain the suffocating expectations, the gradual realization that her father saw her as nothing more than a solution to his financial problems. "My father owns the Rocking W Ranch, about 60 miles southeast of here." She began slowly. "We used to be one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory, but the last few years have been hard. Drought, rustlers, falling beef prices. Papa's been borrowing money to keep us afloat, and now the bills have come due." Thomas finished gently. Charlotte nodded. "Silas Blackwood offered to pay off all our debts in exchange for my hand. In marriage, Papa saw it as the perfect solution, save the ranch and secure my future all at once. But you didn't see it that way, would you?" Charlotte's voice carried an edge of bitterness. "Blackwood is twice my age and has a reputation for ruthlessness that extends far beyond business. There are stories, women who've crossed him who've ended up hurt, or worse. And Papa knew all of this. He simply didn't care, as long as Blackwood's money kept flowing." Thomas frowned, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Silas Blackwood. I've heard the name. Runs cattle up near Denver, doesn't he? Big operation, the biggest in Colorado territory." Charlotte confirmed. "And he's not particular about how he acquired most of his land or livestock. But he's rich, and that's all Papa could see." "So you ran 3 days ago." "The morning of what was supposed to be my wedding day." Charlotte managed a bitter laugh. "I left Blackwood standing at the altar in front of half the territory's elite. I imagine he's not taking the humiliation well." "No," Thomas said grimly. "I imagine he's not." The concern in his tone made Charlotte's stomach clench with fresh worry. "You think I've made things worse by running for yourself?" "No, a forced marriage to a man like that would have been worse than anything you might face out here." "But Blackwood," Thomas shook his head. "Men with that kind of power and pride don't take public embarrassment lightly. He'll want you found, if only to save face. His men are already looking," Charlotte admitted. "I saw them today, not far from where you found me. They mentioned," she swallowed hard, "they said dead or alive." Thomas's expression darkened. "He'd really go that far?" "I think so. If he can't have me as a wife, he'll settle for making sure no one else can either. And if I'm dead, well, that just makes me a tragic victim instead of a woman who defied him publicly." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the walls outside. The wind continued its lonely howling, reminding them both of the wilderness that stretched in all directions beyond the warm circle of the ranch house. "You can't go back," Thomas said finally. It wasn't a question. No. Even if I wanted to, which I don't. Papa made his choice clear. I'm no longer his daughter. I'm a commodity that failed to perform as expected. And you can't go forward. Not with Blackwood's men hunting you. Charlotte felt tears threaten again. "I know I'm asking too much. You don't owe me anything. And harboring me could bring trouble to your door. She paused, struggling to find words for the desperate hope that had driven her to his door. "I just needed somewhere to rest, to think, to figure out what comes next." Thomas studied her for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion, the fear, the stubborn determination that still burned in her green eyes despite everything she'd been through. Something in her spirit called to the part of him that had rebuilt his life from ashes, that understood what it meant to refuse to surrender to circumstances beyond your control. "What if I told you there might be another option?" he said slowly. Charlotte looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you didn't have to keep running? What if there was a way to protect you from Blackwood while also giving you the freedom you're fighting for? That's impossible, unless—" Charlotte's eyes widened as she began to understand where his thoughts were leading. "You can't mean a marriage of convenience," Thomas said quietly. "Not the forced union your father tried to arrange, but a partnership between equals. I need help running this ranch, and you need protection from Blackwood's reach. As my wife, legally speaking, you'd be beyond his power to claim." The proposal hung in the air between them, radical and practical all at once. Charlotte stared at him, her mind racing through the implications. It would solve her immediate problem, certainly, but it would also bind her to yet another man, another set of expectations and limitations. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas continued, "I'm not talking about a real marriage, Charlotte. Just a legal arrangement that gives you sanctuary while you figure out what you really want to do with your life. You'd have your own room, your own space, your own choices. I've lived alone for 5 years. I'm not looking to change that arrangement overnight." "Why?" Charlotte whispered. "Why would you risk Blackwood's anger to help a stranger?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old losses and hard-won wisdom. "Because," he said simply, "everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path. And because I remember what it feels like to have everything you care about stripped away. If I can help prevent that from happening to someone else." He shrugged. "Well, seems like the right thing to do." Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and desperation that had been her constant companion for days. Here was a man offering her not passion or romance, but something far more precious: respect, autonomy, and the chance to determine her own fate. "You'd really do that?" she asked. "Take on that kind of risk for someone you just met?" "I would," Thomas replied without hesitation. "The question is, would you?" Charlotte stared at Thomas Brennan for a long moment, her mind reeling from his unexpected proposal. A marriage of convenience. It should have sounded cold, calculated, but the way he offered it with such quiet dignity and respect for her autonomy made it seem like the most generous gift anyone had ever given her. She began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the storm of emotions churning inside her. Relief, gratitude, fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. "You barely know me. How can you be certain I'm worth such a risk?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, perceptive eyes. "I've learned to read people pretty well out here. Has to do with survival, knowing who you can trust and who might put a knife in your back. And I see someone who chose freedom over security, principle over comfort. That tells me more about your character than a dozen Sunday dinners ever could." Before Charlotte could respond, the sound of approaching hoof beats cut through the night air. Both of them froze, listening as multiple horses thundered into the ranch yard. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. "How many?" Charlotte whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "6 riders." Thomas replied grimly, "Well armed, by the look of them. And they're not here for a social call." A harsh voice rang out across the yard. "Brennan, we know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like civilized men." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's Jake Morrison, one of Blackwood's lieutenants. Should have known he'd be leading the hunt." He turned to Charlotte, his expression serious. Whatever happens, stay calm. And trust me." He moved to the door, pausing only to check the Colt revolver at his hip before stepping out onto the porch. Charlotte pressed herself against the window, watching as 6 hard-faced men arranged themselves in a semicircle round the front of the house. Their leader, a thick-set man with cold eyes and a carefully groomed mustache, urged his horse forward. "Morrison," Thomas acknowledged with a nod, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising steadiness. "Little late for a social visit, isn't it?" "Cut the pleasantries, Brennan," Morrison replied, his tone ugly with authority. "We're looking for a runaway bride. Young woman, auburn hair, green eyes, probably traveling light. Word is she was spotted in these parts. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description." Thomas replied easily, "But then, I don't get many visitors out here." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Now see, that's interesting. Because we tracked her horse to within a mile of your spread before the trail went cold. Mighty convenient, wouldn't you say?" Thomas shrugged. "Mountain country's full of old mine shafts and box canyons. Easy enough for someone to lose their way, or worse. Could be she's at the bottom of a ravine somewhere. Food for the coyotes. Could be." Morrison agreed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it for a moment. "But Mr. Blackwood's offering a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery. Might be worth your while to think real hard about whether you've seen anything unusual lately." "How substantial?" Thomas asked, and Charlotte felt her heart sink. Was he considering turning her over after all? $500, Morrison replied, his eyes glittering with avarice. "That's a lot of money for a small rancher like yourself. Enough to see you through a hard winter. Maybe even expand your operation come spring." Thomas whistled low. "That is a generous offer. Makes a man wonder why Blackwood wants this particular woman back so badly. She's his intended bride," Morrison explained with a sneer. "Ran off on their wedding day like some kind of wild animal. Left him standing at the altar in front of half the territory's important folks. Man's got a right to reclaim what belongs to him." "Belongs to him?" Thomas's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Funny way to talk about a woman. Last I checked, slavery was abolished." Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun. "You got a problem with the way Mr. Blackwood conducts his business, Brennan?" "No problem at all," Thomas replied smoothly. "Just seems to me that if a woman doesn't want to marry a man, maybe that man ought to take the hint." "Women don't always know what's best for them," Morrison said with a cruel laugh. "Sometimes they need guidance from their betters. Now, are you going to help us find this runaway? Or do we need to search your property ourselves?" The threat hung heavy in the air. Charlotte could see the tension in Thomas's shoulders. The way his hand hovered near his weapon. 6 against 1 were terrible odds, even for a man who clearly knew how to handle himself. "Tell you what," Thomas said after a moment's consideration. "Why don't you boys water your horses at the trough while I take a look around my buildings? If she's here, I'll find her. If not, you can be on your way knowing you checked everywhere." Morrison considered this, clearly suspicious, but unable to find fault with the offer. 15 minutes, he said finally. "Then we're searching ourselves, whether you like it or not." Thomas nodded and disappeared back into the house. Charlotte met him at the door, her face pale with fear and confusion. "What are you doing? You could have earned $500 and been rid of me." "Money's not everything," Thomas replied curtly, moving quickly to a trunk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a spare set of clothes, men's work pants, a heavy flannel shirt, and a battered hat. "Put these on, quickly, and bind your hair up under the hat." Charlotte didn't argue, moving behind a privacy screen in the corner to change clothes. The men's clothing hung loose on her slender frame, but it would serve its purpose. When she emerged, Thomas was loading supplies into a leather satchel. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen," he explained quietly. "Hidden entrance under a false floor. You can hide there until they're gone." "And then what?" Charlotte asked, struggling with the unfamiliar buttons on the oversized shirt. "They'll be back." Morrison doesn't strike me as the type to give up easily. "Then we implement my other plan," Thomas replied grimly. "We ride to town at first light and find the circuit judge. Get married before Blackwood's men can regroup." Charlotte felt her breath catch. "You're serious about this marriage proposal?" "Dead serious. It's the only way to put you beyond Blackwood's legal reach. as my wife. You'd have protection under the law. Even he can't simply take what belongs to another man. Even if that marriage is a sham, Thomas met her eyes steadily. Won't be a sham if it's legally performed. And that's all that matters from a legal standpoint. The sound of Morrison's voice from the yard reminded them both that time was running short. Brennan, your 15 minutes are almost up. Thomas grabbed Charlotte's hand, leading her quickly through the kitchen to a narrow door she hadn't noticed before. Behind it, wooden steps led down into darkness. He lit a small oil lamp and handed it to her along with the supply satchel. There's food and water down there, plus some blankets. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. I'll come for you when they're gone. Charlotte took the lamp with trembling hands. Thomas, why are you doing this, really? He paused at the top of the steps, his face serious in the lamplight. Because I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing while others suffer. Lost too much that way already. His voice softened slightly. And because I think you're worth saving. Charlotte Whitmore. Before she could respond, he was closing the door above her, leaving her alone in the musty darkness of the root cellar. She could hear his footsteps moving away, then the sound of the front door opening again. Find anything? Morrison's voice carried clearly through the floorboards above. Nothing, Thomas replied. Checked every building twice. If she was here, she's moved on, maybe. Or maybe you're a better liar than I gave you credit for. Morrison's voice was edged with suspicion. Mind if we take a look inside your house, B? My guest, Thomas replied easily. Just mind you wipe your boots. Rosa just scrubbed those floors. Charlotte pressed herself against the stone wall of the cellar. As heavy footsteps tramped through the house above, she could hear furniture being moved, doors slamming, the sound of Morrison's men conducting a thorough search. Her heart hammered, so loudly she was certain they would hear it. Check that pantry again, Morrison ordered, and look for any signs a woman's been here. Hair ribbons, perfume, anything that doesn't belong. The search seemed to go on forever. Charlotte crouched in the darkness, clutching the lamp and trying to control her breathing. Above her, she could hear Thomas answering Morrison's increasingly aggressive questions with calm patience. Finally, after what felt like hours, the footsteps retreated toward the front door. This isn't over, Brennan, Morrison warned. We'll be watching this place. If that woman shows up here, we'll know about it. I'm sure you will, Thomas replied dryly. Anything else I can help you gentlemen with tonight? The sound of horses departing filled Charlotte with relief so intense she felt dizzy. But she remained in the cellar, as Thomas had instructed, until she heard his gentle knock on the door above. They're gone, he called softly. For now. Charlotte climbed the steps on unsteady legs, emerging into the warm kitchen like a mole blinking in sunlight. Thomas was waiting for her, his face grim, with the reality of their situation. How long do we have? She asked. Not long. Morrison will post watchers, but he'll also need to report back to Blackwood. That gives us maybe 6 hours before they come back in force. Thomas moved to the window, scanning the yard for any sign of lingering threats. We leave for town at dawn. It's our only chance. Charlotte sank into a chair, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. In a few hours, she would be married to a man she'd known for less than a day. It was a desperate gamble, a leap of faith that could save her life or doom them both. Thomas, she said quietly, if we do this, if we go through with this marriage, I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to be a help to you, not a burden. I may have been raised as a gentleman's daughter, but I'm not afraid of hard work. Thomas turned from the window, studying her face in the lamplight. I believe you, he said simply. And Charlotte, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever we're walking into, at least you'll be walking into it as a free woman. Outside, the wind continued its restless song through the mountains, carrying with it the promise of change. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, and with it, a marriage born not of love but of necessity. Whether it would prove to be salvation or destruction remained to be seen, but for the first time since her flight began, Charlotte Whitmore felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope.